A political explosion in Budapest. Viktor Orbán finds himself at the center of a major scandal. He has fallen into his own trap. His policy towards Ukraine is already being called a betrayal. Hungarian journalists are sounding the alarm, and the country is talking about a Russian connection and election interference. Meanwhile, Volodymyr Zelenskyy becomes the target of information attacks. They are trying to portray him as a threat to Europe. A financial scandal, blackmail, and sharp statements from government officials. The tension is only increasing, and suddenly a new twist. A US representative is heading to Hungary to support Orbán ahead of the elections. Washington is playing on both fronts. Europe is holding its breath. What is happening in Hungary? How will this affect Ukraine? And will these elections become a turning point? All the details, sensational facts, and political intrigues are coming up in just a moment. Don't miss it. Welcome, this is Ukraine Today. Hello, I'm Solomia Dolik, and here are the latest events from around the world. Urgent news from Budapest. At the center of the scandal is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, whose new policy toward Ukraine is causing a wave of outrage not only in Kyiv, but also among Hungarians themselves. A Hungarian journalist states directly,
"What the Hungarian government is doing is nothing short of betrayal."
And this is not an emotional statement, it's an assessment of the events unfolding right now. The Russian world and turbocharged propaganda. According to sources, agents of Russian military intelligence have arrived in Hungary. Their mission is to influence the elections through social networks and manipulation. And all this is happening against the backdrop of a massive anti-Ukrainian campaign in state media. One of the loudest headlines from a pro-government publication was a real information bombshell.
Ukrainian militants could seize Budapest. A chilling plan of Zelenskyy has leaked.
At the center of these statements is the figure of Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who they are trying to portray as a threat to Europe. A scandal involving money and open blackmail. Another high-profile episode is the confiscation of Ukrainians' funds. Key government official Janos Lazar stated,
"The confiscated money will not be returned to Ukraine until Kyiv reopens the Druzhba oil pipeline, which was bombed by the Russians."
And this is despite the fact that the pipeline was damaged specifically by Russian attacks. European lawyers are already talking about possible violations of international conventions, from human rights to diplomatic norms. But there is another side which is very important. Despite all this pressure, the situation for Orbán no longer looks stable. Sociological data shows that the opposition is gradually pulling ahead, and there are only a few weeks left until the elections. And even within Hungary itself, more and more voices are saying that this campaign has crossed the line. So, as we can see, the outcome could be completely different. And perhaps very soon Hungary will make a choice that changes everything. And against this backdrop, there is yet another twist that looks just as loud and controversial. The US Vice President J.D. Vance is preparing to visit Budapest. According to Reuters, he plans to arrive in the coming days to support Prime Minister Viktor Orbán ahead of the parliamentary elections. And here an openly uncomfortable question arises. The United States, which consistently supports Ukraine and President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in the war against Russia, is at the same time demonstrating political support for Orbán, whose policies are increasingly accused of aligning with the Kremlin. This is not the first such signal. Previously, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio visited Budapest and also publicly expressed support for the Hungarian Prime Minister. In fact, a situation is emerging where Washington is forced to act on two fronts at once. On one hand, there is the strategic support for Ukraine, and on the other, an attempt to maintain influence over Hungary, which is increasingly distancing itself from the common European position. Parliamentary elections in Hungary are scheduled for April 12th, and for Orbán this is, without exaggeration, one of the most challenging moments of his entire time in power. Sociological data shows a tense struggle, and the opposition is gradually strengthening its position. That is why J.D. Vance's visit is seen as an attempt to influence the course of the campaign and bolster the current Prime Minister's standing. However, even with external support, the situation for Orbán remains unstable. Too many scandals, too much public outcry, and too obvious is the question that is now being asked within Hungary itself. Where is the current government leading the country? And that is why these elections may become not just another round, but a turning point. Because despite all this geopolitical maneuvering, the final decision will rest with the citizens. And there are more and more signs that the era of Viktor Orbán is approaching its most difficult and perhaps final test. And while international players are trying to influence the situation and the election campaign enters its decisive phase, even more alarming signals are emerging from within Hungary itself. This is no longer just about the struggle for power. It's about what will happen afterwards. According to Politico, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán may be preparing a scenario that would allow him to retain control even in the event of an election defeat. And this sounds like a political bombshell. Former ruling party MP Zuzana Seleni directly warns that if the opposition wins without a constitutional majority, Orbán will have enough tools to effectively paralyze the work of parliament. We're talking about dragging out procedures, blocking key decisions, creating artificial crises, and even the possibility of provoking a state of emergency. Political scientist Gabor Toka adds that Orbán could go even further. He might refuse to concede defeat if the result is not convincing. Among the possible scenarios are challenging the election results, inciting protests, and undermining the legitimacy of the new government. And all this is not necessarily for an immediate comeback, but rather to weaken opponents and prepare for a return. Against this backdrop, the political temperature in the country is already off the charts. The polls are contradictory. Some give the advantage to the opposition force TISA, led by Péter Magyar, while others favor the ruling party. The campaign is accompanied by mutual accusations, information attacks, and distrust of the results even before the actual voting. And against the backdrop of all these scenarios of possible government deadlock and political crisis, the information space explodes with yet another statement that instantly spread across social media. This refers to the words of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán regarding Russia's war against Ukraine. A thesis began to spread widely online, claiming that Orbán supposedly does not consider Vladimir Putin an aggressor. In the interview, he was asked directly whether he considers Putin an aggressor and whether there is a moral obligation to support Ukrainians as victims of the war. To this, Orbán replied,
"No, I don't think so."
But this is specifically in the context of a moral obligation. At the same time, throughout the conversation, he admits several times, according to international law, Russia is the aggressor. Urgent. An unexpected twist has appeared in the grand political game. Kyiv has outplayed Budapest. Orbán is cornered. Ukraine is demonstrating cold calculation and confidence with money, but without making concessions to Putin. This seems to break Budapest's political scheme. Now the intrigue only grows. Orbán's problems are just beginning. A political boomerang. All the details ahead.
Even though Hungary has officially issued a veto against granting Ukraine a €90 billion financial loan package, it is clear that Orbán's blackmail will ultimately not succeed in the end. The strategists of the pro-Kremlin politician miscalculated, and Ukraine has enough money to hold out until the elections in Hungary.
Brussels expects that Ukraine will face a budget deficit only at the end of next month, several weeks later than initially anticipated, as Kyiv is hoping that Hungary will lift its veto after the crucial parliamentary elections on April 12th, which could remove pro-Kremlin Prime Minister Viktor Orbán from office. Initially, EU officials expected that funding for Ukraine would run out at the beginning of April, when the first payment from the €90 billion fund was supposed to be made. But Budapest blocked this plan.
On April 12th, elections will be held in Hungary, and according to the latest polls, Orbán is losing. The main political opposition TISA party has now significantly increased its lead among decided voters to a total of 12%. According to recent polls, 50% of all voters support TISA, while only 38% support Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's long-standing ruling party known as Fidesz.
The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, fully realizing that he is now trailing behind the united opposition in the latest public opinion polls, and that even the high-profile endorsement from former President Donald Trump is not helping his cause, is of course resorting to increasingly extraordinary and desperate measures in order to preserve his electoral chances and maintain his firm grip on political power. And his attempts to present himself with his, I would say, special relationship with Putin as the Prime Minister of Peace, who ensures peace for Hungary at a time when all other European countries support a belligerent, corrupt and dangerous Ukraine, this is part of his election campaign.
Viktor Orbán planned to persuade Volodymyr Zelenskyy to unblock the Druzhba oil pipeline. But it seems that the money in the Ukrainian treasury will last until the end of April. By that time, elections will have taken place in Hungary, and most likely the pro-Kremlin politician will lose them. And that means Orbán will lose the war he started himself.
In fact, the Hungarian Prime Minister was counting on Kyiv running out of resources right before the elections in Hungary, which are scheduled for April 12th. This is exactly what prompted such a confident, pompous and solemn declaration to force Kyiv by force. Orbán's political strategists, some of whom are likely connected to Kremlin structures, were counting on demonstrating political strength and a victory over Ukraine precisely at the beginning of April, right before the elections, when Ukraine would be facing a budget deficit.
It seems that the story about the detention of Ukrainian cash in transit vehicles transporting currency and valuables is also an element of pressure on Ukraine. Today, the Hungarian government adopted a resolution to confiscate everything from the Oszczęd Bank vehicles.
The fact that they did not return these material valuables, but at the same time deported the cash couriers, indicates that there is definitely nothing criminal going on there. It's simply politics and an attempt, I don't know, well, to take the money for themselves for the time being, at least while the Druzhba oil pipeline is not operating.
Hungarian Minister of Construction and Transport János Lázár essentially confirmed that the seized funds will be kept as leverage over Ukraine until the Druzhba oil pipeline is unblocked.
We know that the Ukrainians are very nervous. If we are being blackmailed, we can't be so foolish as to give in. We did what we did not by accident, and we will not return the money to them.
But despite such unprecedented pressure from Hungary, Ukraine won't have to suffer from Orbán's antics for much longer, especially since Brussels seems to be on Kyiv's side. And despite the veto, the loan will still be allocated on time.
Viktor Orbán no longer hides his sympathy for Putin and Russian policy. That is why, in the case of the €90 billion loan, as in many other matters, Europe must effectively ensure the implementation of its decisions. Hungary signed this decision. I am convinced that Europe can safely use the $90 billion for Ukraine without waiting for additional approval from Budapest.
Most likely, the Druzhba oil pipeline will not be operational by April 12th, no matter how much Orbán wants it or pressures Ukraine. And this will be yet another blow to his already low ratings ahead of the elections.
The moment of truth has arrived. Druzhba is bursting at the seams. The US and the EU are preparing a strike that could wipe out Orbán's energy game. The pipeline, which for years was a tool of influence and blackmail, now risks becoming a symbol of defeat. In Brussels and Washington, they are no longer being polite. On the table is a decision that will redraw the energy map of Europe. For Budapest, this could be a painful knockout. If the plan works, the end of the old scheme and the beginning of a new era without Russian dependence are guaranteed. Be the first to know.
Orbán has gone too far. The end of Druzhba. The oil pipeline that pumped oil to Europe for decades is now under threat.
It was the project of the century. Let me remind you, when these gas pipelines were being built from the USSR to Europe back in the 70s, it was even called the deal of the century, the project of the century, the construction of these pipelines. Now is the time to abandon this project of the century.
The European Union and the United States continue to phase out Russian energy resources, planning a complete halt to gas imports by January 2028, and the share of Russian oil has already dropped to 3%. The strategic goal of the European Commission remains unchanged, to end all imports of raw materials from Russia by the end of 2027. On April 15th, the European Commission will present a legal proposal for a permanent ban on the import of Russian oil. This is happening 3 days after the parliamentary elections in Hungary, so that the oil ban does not become a major factor in the election campaign. The EU wants to enshrine a complete and gradual phase-out of Russian oil in legislation, which will remain in force even if a peace agreement in Ukraine leads to the lifting of European sanctions.
Russia is losing the pro-Russian forces it still has. You know, back in the waning days of the Soviet Union and at the beginning of Ukraine's independence, there was a very popular Italian TV series called La Piovra, the octopus. And there's a phrase in it: our friends are only those whom we can buy. Well, Russia's friends are those whom Russia can buy. If Russia can't buy friends, if it doesn't have the resources, then Russia in fact won't have any friends either. At the same time, Russia itself, which in many ways earns its income on the European market, is losing its most profitable market because what remains for it is the Chinese market.
Hungary and Slovakia are among the last importers of Russian oil left in the European Union. Other EU members have found new suppliers for themselves over the past 4 years. According to Reuters, deliveries of Russian oil via the southern branch of the Druzhba pipeline amounted to 9.7 million tons in 2025. Slovakia received almost 5 million, and Hungary a little more than 4 million.
Huge purchases of energy resources from Russia. Listen, in the first 10 months of 2025, the EU paid Russia $26 billion, as far as I remember, mostly for energy resources. So, on the one hand, you say that Russia is a threat to you. On the other hand, you give them money by buying their resources. Then you could buy these resources not from Russia, you could buy them elsewhere. Accordingly, you are essentially bringing to life Lenin's well-known saying, where he said that they will hang the capitalists with the very rope that these same capitalists will sell them.
Hungary receives Russian oil at 15 to 20% cheaper than it could buy it from other suppliers. Profits from reselling cheap Russian oil at market prices in Hungary do not go toward lowering prices for the population, but instead are accumulated for the benefit of a narrow circle of elites connected to Viktor Orbán's government, experts say.
One specific and notable aspect of this systemic corruption is when they say, listen carefully to what we propose. You will guarantee and facilitate the process so that Russian resources pass through you, and in return, you will receive these resources at significantly reduced and more favorable prices. This significant profit margin that results will ultimately find its way into your own personal pockets, and you will have a substantial and direct financial benefit that can be used to stay in power and for your upcoming political election campaigns. So these are not the interests of Hungary and Slovakia. These are the interests of Orbán and his circle, the interests of Fico and his circle, who want to profit from Russian resources by reselling them to Europe.
The United States is also striking at Russian energy carriers. However, for Washington, the key issue is not oil but gas. Hungary already signed a contract with the United States for gas supplies back in December of last year. And if the southern branch of the Druzhba pipeline is finally shut down and Hungary switches to American gas and nuclear fuel, it will not only be a blow to the Kremlin's revenues, but will also remove the last levers of energy blackmail.
The strategy of the Soviet Union, which was passed on to Russia, is to make Europe dependent on itself through this so-called gas needle. Just as addicts get hooked on drugs through these needles, in the case of gas, the benefits of obtaining resources from Russia make European politics, let's say, dependent on Russia's interests. In other words, Russia makes these countries dependent on itself through the factor of energy resources. Reforms are carried out in European countries that maintain dependence on Russian resources, and this, first and foremost, benefits Russia.
No matter how hard Putin tries to keep his allies, he will not succeed. Europe no longer tolerates delays, and this is already being felt now. Orbán is rapidly losing room to maneuver. His decisions are being blocked in the EU, and his political weight is melting before our eyes. Elections are ahead, and they could prove fatal for Putin's friend. Yet another Kremlin puppet is experiencing an earthquake. Fico is under a barrage of criticism. In Slovakia, there is growing talk about the need to tighten the screws. The rules are changing. The moment of truth has arrived. Let's watch.
Orbán and Fico are increasing pressure on Ukraine.
This is a failure and not the signal we wanted to send.
Slovakia has officially stopped providing emergency electricity supplies.
We will lose a lot of money, and we have the right to respond to this.
As a result of the cessation of emergency electricity supplies to Ukraine, it may happen that hospitals performing surgeries on those wounded after a Russian attack will be left without power.
The Slovak opposition is preparing a criminal complaint against Fico for this decision.
Specifically, the charges include abuse of official authority, treason, inhumanity, a terrorist act, and violation of duties in the management of state property.
In addition, Prime Minister Robert Fico threatened to reconsider Slovakia's position on Ukraine's EU membership if there is a boycott of the transfer of Russian oil.
The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, tells us that we must buy gas and oil from anyone except Russia, even if it is more difficult and more expensive.
And while it may be difficult to implement restrictions on electricity supplies to Ukraine in practice, the pressure regarding the allocation of a new tranche of aid from the European Union is now in question precisely because of Bratislava.
Despite the fact that we do not have the resources to lower electricity prices, Brussels intends to approve another military loan to Ukraine in the amount of 90 billion euros, of which Ukraine will not return a single cent. I believe it is absolutely right that Slovakia did not take part in approving this loan.
The EU Council adopted 2 documents for a 90 billion loan to Ukraine. However, in addition to Fico, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is also blocking them.
We are coordinating our actions with the Slovaks and, if necessary, we will also take this third step. We will not act as long as the Druzhba oil pipeline remains closed. We will ensure the supply of fuel to Hungary and take the necessary countermeasures until the supply is restored.
The President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, accused Hungary of blackmail.
I wrote to Prime Minister Orbán that Hungary is violating the principle of fair and open cooperation and urged it to immediately join in implementing the decision adopted by the European Council.
Orbán and Fico are well aware that Ukraine has nothing to do with the damage to the Druzhba oil pipeline. Foreign Minister Andrii Sybiha stated that Ukraine wants to resolve the conflict and is ready for a direct meeting between President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Orbán, but has not yet received a positive response. Fico and Orbán are using the topics of oil and war to gain political dividends related to the upcoming parliamentary elections in Hungary, where Orbán's position has been significantly weakened.
The pro-government corrupt system is not interested in the real problems of the people and does not even dare to look them in the eye.
The current Prime Minister of Hungary is trying to strengthen his position by using tough rhetoric towards Ukraine and the European Union.
If we have a government supported by Brussels, they will drag us into the war. If we have a national government, we will still have a chance to avoid it.
Power in Hungary has been in Orbán's hands for 16 years now, and he continues to shift responsibility onto an external, imaginary enemy.
The Brussels deadlock is the TISA. In exchange for a few pats on the back and immunity, they will agree to deals with Brussels and fulfill all their demands. They will say yes to war, to funding Ukraine, to settling migrants, and to gender propaganda.
The TISA party, led by Péter Magyar, is ahead of Viktor Orbán's political force. And this can be called a historic moment for the country.
Probably this is now the key story in Europe. All eyes, of course, are on these April elections, and all bets are on them because this could radically change the situation. The return of pro-European forces to power in Hungary would finally put an end to the issue that every time any sanctions or measures to support Ukraine are adopted in Europe, it is always such a struggle. This center of resistance could finally disappear.
Holding on to power is a matter of personal freedom. And Robert Fico is in the same boat as his colleague. But they risk losing funding from European funds, since Slovakia and Hungary are largely dependent on assistance from the European Union. At the moment, both Hungary and Slovakia can create temporary political and financial difficulties, in particular by delaying decisions regarding aid to Ukraine or its European integration. But the European Union can always invoke Article 7, which allows it to suspend a member state's voting rights.
Well, that's all from me for now. And what do you think about these events? We look forward to your comments. There's more to come. Stay informed about the main news and don't forget to like. Wishing you peaceful skies above.